First of all, I'd like to say thank you for being invited. It's been very interesting so far. I'm not an academic, so I'd like to use that license to make some more general comments about what I've heard today and yesterday. First of all, I'd like to start by running through kind of the immediate crisis and what I perceive as kind of crisis response and the implications I think that has had for democracy. And then move on to the wider question, which I think is the much bigger and important one about kind of addressing the Euro's constitutional crisis or design flaws, as I would call them, which I think is really the bottom line of the crisis in terms of its impact on democracy. So as we all know, and it's been suggested by other speakers, we've seen a divide between creditor countries and debtor countries. And I think the first place you actually saw the demands of keeping the euro show on the road, if you like, was in the creditor countries. You saw bailout requests clashing with national democracy. I'm thinking of Finland, where you had the True Finns, and in the Netherlands as well, to some extent, in terms of protest parties and so on. And I think this had the effect of hardening the government's positions when they went in to negotiate the bailout packages and so on. And they've had the effect of hardening how national governments deal with the euro crisis. So again, I'm thinking of Mark Rutte saying that Greece won't get a penny more, which may be severely tested in the next week or so. Finland's demands for collateral in the Greek bailout negotiations, I think those were driven by kind of protests or anti-bailout protests at the national level. So I guess in that sense, you could say that national politics played a sort of a functional role in expressing kind of national preferences for now. And I think the next stage has been in the debtor countries, which, again, as we all know, are facing huge austerity programs, unprecedented levels of internal devaluation because they can't use, obviously, currency devaluation. This has led to social unrest and, again, also has manifested itself in protest parties and the rise of more fringe parties. And some countries have obviously started this process of internal devaluation, have actually come quite a long way, thinking about the countries in programs. Other Eurozone countries haven't. I'm probably thinking about France and Italy here, who probably also have to adjust their levels of competitiveness in line with the kind of northern countries. But while I would argue that these structural reforms are necessary over the longer term, I think there are real doubts as to whether the austerity that's being kind of foisted upon Southern Europe will ever be sufficient in itself to keep the euro together in the long term. First of all, they take a long time to take effect. They have very kind of negative short-term consequences in terms of job losses, reduced wages, and all the rest of it. And increasingly, the Troika or the European Commission is being, in these countries, is being seen as an agent of the northern countries or the creditor countries, and specifically Germany. And I think that is obviously it's created this very clear and very marked divide between the creditors and the debtors. And as was mentioned earlier, the debtor countries managed to unite in protest against the creditor countries. I'm not sure that's necessarily a positive thing for kind of fostering European identity or so on. So turning to the longer term issues and the kind of the constitutional crisis, I would describe it as. I think there's obviously an economic perspective and a more political one. In terms of what happens next, it obviously depends on your diagnosis of the cause of the crisis and the problems. I would argue that it's a crisis of competitiveness. The currency union has replaced exchange rate risk for credit risk, and being human nature, we've mispriced credit risk, and that is where we are now. And as long as you have cross-border flows, there are always going to be surpluses and deficits within the Eurozone, and the question is, how do you finance them? And they've been financed by credit from the northern countries to the southern countries, and obviously that credit was mispriced, and we are where we are. And I think what that basically boils down to is the age-old choice between, because I think it's impossible to eradicate that issue of mispricing credit. It's boom and bust is with us to stay, I think, for the future. So you have to find a way of financing those deficits within the Eurozone. Simply having rules on national budgets isn't enough, because, as we said, the crisis in Spain and Ireland were good old-fashioned banking crises based on real estate bubbles and so on. So I think you come back to the age-old problem that the Eurozone has always had, is stick or twist. Is it going to be a full transfer union? Whichever method that takes. I mean, the obvious one is a Eurozone budget. Or is there going to be some form of breakup? I think that is the fundamental bottom line that faces the Eurozone. And then I come to the democracy side of it, the politics side of it. I think there were some very interesting sessions yesterday, which again I think diagnosed the democratic problem correctly, which is essentially that the EU has always had a democratic deficit, but because it's the policy areas it's been focused on, it has never been quite as acute as it is now in the Eurozone. Because as soon as you start talking about issues like tax and spend, issues that are integral to national sovereignty, the democratic deficit is there now for all to see. But I think what also struck me were there were some quite heroic hopes for this idea of creating a transnational European identity, and I think this is the bottom line. There is no genuine European democracy. I have argued that the economics would suggest that you need a transfer union to keep the Eurozone together in its current form in the long term. I think this is really what the rest of the world and financial markets are really waiting for, in terms of they want to have certainty in the long-term future of the Eurozone. I think they need to be confident that that is where the Eurozone is heading in a sustainable fashion. However, again, bringing democracy back into it, I think as long as people think nationally and feel attached to a national sense of identity, I think there's a real risk that we could impose a fiscal union that would store up greater problems for the future. And I think that's a real risk. And I think, again, what we've seen is that politicians are very reluctant to address this bottom line decision. One of the sessions earlier was talking about banking union, which is a very small form of fiscal union, if you like, if you use all three components that was talked about earlier. And politicians' reluctance to talk about the real issue about having deposit guarantee schemes and common resolution schemes is symptomatic, I think, of the wider failure of politicians to really be honest with people about what the Eurozone crisis means. Instead of dealing with those issues, we've spent 6 months talking about a common supervisory system, which, although important, doesn't address the fundamental problem, and banking union is useless without having deposit guarantee schemes and all the rest of it. So I think so far the euro has managed to get through the crisis through a mixture of pragmatism and fear. Fear of breakup has moved the euro forward on the road to greater integration. But I think what the Eurozone needs to ask of people in the long term can't be sustained simply by fear. It needs a degree of emotional loyalty and sense of common identity that I think is lacking. And I think, importantly, the current crisis is actually undermining any hope that you could create one. As I said, we're seeing the creditors pitted against the debtors. So I think that is the issue that we all have to really engage with, and I think politicians would do their people a great service by really kind of engaging in that issue and really explaining to people what the long-term consequences of the Eurozone crisis are. I know that the immediate issues need addressing, but that would all be for nothing if we don't really consider the long-term implications of where the Eurozone might be heading. Thank you.